Greetings, listeners. Welcome. I am Isidora, and this is the Avalon Podcast. Join me for a series of interviews, discussions, storytelling in topics of myth, magic, spirituality, and esoteric science. Today, I am here with my co-creative sister, Raven, who's going to share her experience and our experience of the dragon shadow and shadow work in general. Raven Alison, who will be my co-host, is a psychoshamanic practitioner specialized in Fae Soul related studies and dream integration. We are both feeling passionate about nature's healing methods and helping people release illusionary fantasy aspects of their reality. So the journey started really when I was invited to Raven's podcast, The Confession of the Fae Soul, and we explored a variety of topics. And I think we've opened Pandora's box there a little bit by mentioning a lot of concepts and experiences that we've both shared and had around shadow work, the dragon shadow in the Fae Soul consciousness, the Faery Accord. And today, and through this series of episodes, we're aiming to answer those questions and elaborate on these topics. So welcome, Raven, to Avalon Podcast.
Thank you so much, Dea. And yeah, it was an honor to have you on Confessions of a Fae Soul podcast. So for those that haven't listened to it, by all means, that's available on all platforms, and you can go check it out, where we just kind of skim across the surface of what we were asked to kind of dive deeper into. So that's our intention for this series. And yeah, I really want to encourage everybody to, if you're resonating in the Fae Soul, or if you're resonating with integration of the dragon as a collective shadow, set your intentions when you're going to be listening to this, open a space so that you're really tapped into more of your own inner heart resonance. Because I know Dea and I agree on this. When we're in these like kind of mythic stories and we're investigating the shadow of something kind of not widely discussed, it's really, really important that we are honing in on what feels good for us inside of our body, our heart, and our soul, because not everything might resonate. And so, yeah, just like set a space, get your journals, get your pen and paper, and kind of just, note different things that have soul resonance for your Fae Soul. And then you can always reach out to either of us if you have any deeper questions.
Yes, absolutely. And also, we're really trying to encourage people to approach the shadow work practically, right? So it's a lot of how-to and little tips that are going to be discussed in this episode and this series of episodes that we're sharing. So, there will be sections that certainly will be revolutionary in a way, or perhaps just make sense for your experience as an individual.
Yeah.
Right. So when I think it's good to start by identifying the shadow. So Raven, what is a shadow for you, or perhaps even shadow work?
Yeah, I think like shadow work is kind of like a buzz term right now. We see it like everybody can kind of talk about shadow work and has their own integrative methods. There's a lot of different methods that you can use, but from everything that I've learned and experienced, and I do have quite a few certifications in shadow work, at a core, the shadow is literally any part of us that remains kind of unconscious to us. So even though Dea and I have done extensive shadow work in ourselves, her and I could very well have autonomous parts of our unconscious that are still, interacting. So what does that mean? The shadow is, if we're going to go off of this like unconscious part of self, it has personal components that are individual and unique to you, and it has collective components which are interacting with us through, symbols, characters, motifs, and archetypes. And I don't know if it's like relevant, but if you've never done shadow work and you kind of want to know, like, oh no, what is it, how does it manifest it in our waking experience? So that's where Dea and I are really trying to like empower today. We're going to kind of give you tips to, let the shadow work be less intimidating and more of a self-observation, more of a journey through life where it's just something ongoing, especially in the Fae consciousness and the dragon. It's something that's happening, and we're going to get into that when we talk to Dea. But you can look at the shadow as any rejected part of self. This happens from our programming and conditioning, where if we were taught that part of us wasn't good, then we reject it into our unconscious. And then it also happens through loops, the shadow loops. So that's how you can identify it as well. And all I mean by that is, I'm sure we can all relate. We have the same relationships. Oh my gosh, this is happening to me again. The same scenario. That is an unconscious part of you trying to get acknowledged. And then it also can happen from trauma. So trauma, and what is trauma? I always use the analogy of a cup of water. It's literally any emotional experience that is more than you can handle at one time. And so hopefully that kind of explains. But the scariest thing about the shadow is that it's unconscious, and all the shadow wants to do is to become conscious. But just remember that it's just a cup at a time. We don't have to race through it or do anything. Hopefully that identifies what I view as the shadow and why it's important for us to integrate, because we really underestimate its autonomy. And so when these parts aren't being acknowledged, especially if they've been created from us fixating on an idealized version of self, and Dea and I are definitely going to go into that when we dissect the Faery Accord. Because if we're identifying as a fairy, then where does the human go? You know what I mean? So those types of things. If we're hyper fixated on an identity, then and we're not something, then it can go into the shadow, and that's where it gains a lot of power, a lot of denseness, and that's where we kind of lose our sovereignty. I don't know if any of that resonates for you, Dea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it was a very good description, and it's just the understanding that shadow self is a part of the self, is part of what constitutes as the self. So it's not something that we can really sort of detach from, which is why we then speak on integration, right? Because it's something that we want to welcome. So I like to use the analogy of first of all, you become aware of the unseen, which is what shadow is. So it becomes seen, then you witness it, you got to understand it. You study it as self-observant, and then you basically just give it a hug. So you have to approach it with compassion in order to integrate it, right? So this, in a way, is a relationship with the unseen part of yourself that you would use these methods to any other human relationship. You would get to know each other first, understand each other first, and welcome each other. And there is certainly part of, the shadow identity. So the form this unconscious part of you takes that, might not serve you, right? Because that identity was actually adopted due to those experiences Raven just mentioned, in which case you can decide to not continue in connection with that. But generally, we want the shadow self to be integrated. And I really want to encourage people to not look at the shadow self, and especially the dragon shadow, which we're going to in a bit, as an outside entity, because that creates an inner battle. We're battling part of the self. So you cannot actually spiritually evolve or as a human being evolve at all if there is part of your self that you are continuously battling, because it takes a lot of energy to do so. But yeah, that was a great description. And just to move into identifying the dragon shadow. So if we understand the shadow as the unseen parts of ourselves, the shadow is this, I'm not even 100% sure that we're fully unconscious of its existence. I think there is a level of awareness, or at least the ego self, right, is aware that is there. It's just not willing to look at it. And that's the peculiar aspects of dragon shadow, because dragons are huge. It's a magnificent, large beingness. So actually, the dragon shadow hardly ever remains indefinitely unseen, because it is taking up so much space within the self. And I do think that everyone within their consciousness has a dragon shadow aspect. It could be a seed, It could be a very magnificent, large form, depending on the journey of the individual's soul and the personality as it developed. But it's there, and I think it is eventually comes to light. It comes to be seen. But if we are not consciously choosing that, then what will happen is the dragon will force itself to the front. It will force itself to be seen. And when it's not invited to the table, it will flip the table, right? And in these cases, sometimes the ego will choose the shadow as the dragon, as the soul identity. And when the ego chooses the dragon as a soul identity, then all other aspects of the self becomes dysfunctional because it's an overarching, over-encompassing force. I don't know how you feel about that, Raven.
Well, I was like, oh, this is like, you know what? It's gotten some wheels turning, and I want to kind of reiterate what Dea said about the magnitude of the dragon shadow, and if we're really not going to acknowledge it, then it makes itself seen. And also like the way that it makes itself seen. So how you might identify that, in my experience, is of extreme polarizations, regardless of what it is. And we can maybe go into some of the things, whether it's like greed or whatever. But I guess like something that really went off in my brain when you were sharing that is like, if the ego identifies with the dragon, like, and then it starts negating all of those parts, and that is like how a shadow or an unseen part gains power. And that is kind of like what we see manifest, in my opinion, of how the dragon shadow is acting collectively, because the ego plays the self so well. And you know what I mean? And if
Yes.
we're going to identify as the dragon and that's who I am, then that is a real fast way to get like out of the true dragon, which is like an earth consciousness, and into like this archetypal dragon, which is more like these stories we've been fed and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in regards to like, just these other aspects that you're kind of mentioning, it can be a little bit of a beast to identify and integrate.
Certainly.
And I don't sorry, what was it? Refresh my memory on the last point that you just made, if you do remember it.
Well, it's just that, there is and I really kind of identified 3 different ways dragon shadow shows up, and that is one of them. But if we are not actually consciously welcoming or willing to see the dragon in a shadow, it will force itself to the front and will take over almost all other identities, right? So it flips the table. It was the analogy I used. And I think that commonly happens with people, and then as a result we see a certain pattern manifest, which today we can call a sort of messiah syndrome almost, right? That because actually when the dragon is not in the shadow, when it's consciously chosen and seen and experienced, so we've gone through the pattern of seeing it, observing it, studying it, hugging it. So we're actually welcoming that, and we're building a relationship with the dragon within ourselves. Then it is represent creational power and spiritual power specifically. But when it is a sort of a shadow overtake, then that power manifests in a, we can say in a very destructive way. So the individuals who have that experience with their dragon shadow will end up being often, gurus, spiritual readers, who create environment where they can receive a level of worship that is based on their knowledge or spiritual wisdom. And they create sort of very dogmatic, culty environments around themselves, because the dragon is power, that magical power. And magical power is the ability to use our free will to manifest reality, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's one version, right? So we've become the shadow side of the great magician. or the spiritual leader, the guru, and then all sorts of cultural aspects of that exist.
Maybe like the God complex, right? Like
Yeah, the
where
Messiah complex, the God complex, exactly. Now, the other side is when Dragon in the Shadow does not flip the table, because we actually look at dragon as something to fight, something to defeat. The dragon as the enemy, the dragon as the antagonist, the beast, the destroyer. And so we are choosing another identity, another part of the self as the hero, and fight the dragon within. And the emotion and the frequency behind this is usually fear of one's own power. So we are actually fighting our own spiritual power, our abilities, our skills. So in your experience as a person, this sometimes manifests as fear of your own spiritual abilities, fear of often sight, so the ability to see. So those of you who have oracling skills and oracling abilities, not just good intuition, but actually the ability to see patterns unfold, past, present, and future, that is a spiritual ability, that is a skill, a magical skill, if you like. And because of the fear of that actually manifesting in a healthy way, it's repressed. So in that case, we will be battling, the magic inside of us, the spiritual power inside of us, because we're afraid of it. And that version of Dragon Shadow is what manifests into the collective with the persecution of nature magicians, the persecution of witches, the divine feminine characters of myth and history who represent this creational wisdom, because they can easily be labeled the dragons of the collective unfolding through timelines.
Yeah, and that is a good point to bring up, like a lot of those things, especially from like I am not necessarily a Jungian fan, but Carl Jung is a psychiatrist who coined the shadow and gave a lot of this kind of work documentation through interpreting dreams and the unconscious and archetypes and myths. And so I love like a lot of the parallels, because if we look at Jungian psychology in the way that Dea has just so kindly articulated the dragon shadow, a Jungian view would put the dragon into the ego, and then the hero's job is to kind of constantly slay that, as she was saying. And so what we're suggesting, so you can take it if it resonates, is that we're actually pulling that dragon like out of that component. But it's a good, I feel like it's very powerful to highlight that that's there in the, especially in the mental body, because right away, even if you're identifying, like Dea says, in this divine feminine rising, and you've got your powers and you're all like, yeah, I'm in my sacred rage, we see it a lot. There's this other component of that other side, which if you aren't aware that they're like right in our unconscious collectively, so this is how the collective shadow kind of like can get in there without you realizing that there's that hero component or the beast component that might want to hijack that, or could be a part of you that you've literally denied. So you're all like in this, it's kind of an illusionary feminine empowerment is how this has manifested inside myself, and I've seen it in a lot of different Fae Souls. So there's nothing to really be scared about, but one way that we can identify this is that we really have to get clear at exactly what Dea just articulated, is what aspects of myself am I afraid of in my own power? And then are there any aspects of myself that's trying to fight that or figure it out, or is looping in an illusionary form of healing? Because the dragon can do that too. And like, I know the Ouroboros kind of comes to mind, is that if you're really not in the earth, if you are not rooted in your body, if you are not rooted in a true heart, then the dragon, in my experience, kind of splits and becomes more mind and physical. And then that's where we can get kind of looping. And the reason for that, in my experience, is kind of these concepts that we're articulating, is that in the stories, they've all been rewritten. and, make us scared to own our power and make us afraid to be in the dragon. And what's coming to mind as well is like the trees, nature, those types of things can really help you ground in more of a true resonance of what the dragon is. And like, I don't know, if I was doing dragon shadow work, then I always kind of just anchor myself in the trees to do that. And it might sound weird, but like a tree, as the trees are literally an embodiment of unconditional love in all of the realms. So they really know a lot of that serpent dragon energy in its true form. I think that you would agree with that, Dea. I
Yeah,
don't
no,
know.
absolutely. I think, working with any elemental body, any living
Yeah.
elemental body, and an earth elemental body is actually that's the part of the method of how we do dragon shadow work. And just to sort of go back to the Jungian parts you mentioned, the Jung really looked at the dragon as the unconscious itself, and the myth he was reviewing was mythology of a very small group into history. Like dragon mythology and the archetypal dragon in our human consciousness is so vast and so different, depends on culture and timeline, that I think it's just, because he only viewed a couple of the myth around Tiamat and Marduk, he kind of chose the dragon as, the feminine archetype, the mother archetype, and then associated it also with a mother wound, which don't agree with. So there's a lot of parts of Jungian psychology that I think is just, at the time, of course, it was ahead of its time, but since then a lot's changed. And I think the way he identified certain experiences that were very human, we now know is just not accurate. So I'm not trying to encourage people to do shadow work with his understanding of archetypes and symbols. And I also want to sort of illiterate that there is a dragon exists that's within ourselves and within our consciousness, and sometimes overtakes the mind body, right? But there is a conscious dragon exists within the earth, and that's kind of where the two links together, that there is a conscious living being that we are in communication with, because we are in a communication with nature and the earth itself, that resides within and around our home. And it is very much like how you see it in Avatar a little bit, where there is this consciousness, this oneness that is within all, and we can kind of tap in to have this communication channels open, and also to flip the sort of understanding of our unseen shadow so that it becomes seen and then it becomes loved. And so when the dragon is empowered, when the dragon is not in the shadow, it is creational wisdom. It holds information in our DNA, in knowledge of eternal life that is within us and around us, in constant flow and motion. So how we really do shadow work with the dragon is through the elemental forms of nature. And mythology told this many, many times. We're just not really listening to the story, because even in any culture you look at, the dragon is either thunderbolt and lightning, or it's rain, or it's a river, or it's the earth itself, right? So it's a force of nature, and that's how it manifests in our environment. So if we interact with that force of nature as an ally, right, then the dragon shadow within us will be in allyship with the natural creation or codes that's within that dragon consciousness in the planet. So nature really becomes like our anchor in this practice.
Yeah. Well, it has to be. I think it like, and that's actually like where the dragon in my own experience really got me, is like, I I thought that I was rooted, and I really wasn't, even though I was very much an activist for nature and doing a lot of things on the surface that appeared to be good. At a core, I had this hidden shadow. And I think, like, to go off of what Dea is saying and stuff like that, and just to touch on the Jungian stuff, like, I don't really agree that we should be integrating the dragon with his lens at all. Like, he was very much, for those that don't know, and you don't really need to know much about him, just look at him like his own story. He was very fixated on the dragon in the mother.
Mm-hmm.
Dea has said. And he also, I think Siegfried was like one of his like main myths. He just kept circulating around where that guy's just like, it was a psychonaut. So just fighting.
Exactly. I think he was a little bit in love with the mystery of that divine feminine that is destroyer and creator, and kind of got lost in that one myth, and all, didn't zoom out and say, oh, there are 7 other cultures and 6,000 of years of depictions. Maybe I should look at those too.
Yeah. And it was and also he was like very fixated on the anima, which
Yeah,
we could look at as the soul body of the
yeah,
dragon flowing through earth.
could do.
So yeah, and with the elementals and everything like that, I just feel like I'm trying to really like tap in where I wonder if we could, because the way that Dea and I want to do this as we progress is we kind of want to break it down each episode where we're kind of going
Yeah.
through these things. So I'm wondering, Dea, if you like, maybe hopefully I'm not jumping ahead, but maybe we could talk about how kind of like the Faery Accord is part of the dragon shadow, because like that's the root for me, right? We're rooting into earth, and then it's like, okay, now what? Like how am I, because that's like for me, that's where your story is going to be really unique,
Yeah.
depending on all of these individual aspects. So I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but I would
I
love to.
think we can do that. So the collective dragon shadow is the trauma or the experience of being detached from the creator.
Yeah.
And the creator and the creation process was sealed by a covenant, what we call the original covenant, which is the same as the Faery Accord. So within the Faery Accord, the stories, the codes, the experiences of the self and where the self belongs and how it truly belongs to the heart of this earth, really, and how we are an expression of that dragon creation is outlined. And there's obviously other members of this agreements and covenant, the Faery Accord, that includes the Fae component, the dragon component, and the human component within this agreement. And we've all pledged a certain level of loyalty to the 4th element, which is the living consciousness of Earth itself, and to each other, a certain way of coexisting, cooperating that was harmonious and respectful. And I think that's a very beautiful ideology. And if you look at the world today, you will not see that. So we are perpetually existing in a false reality that is continuously abusing the Faery Accord. Because we are always operating from a dragon shadow collectively, in a sense that we reject the road that leads us back home to creation, or forgot the pathway that leads us back to creation. So, the oneness concept, we are all from one mother, is very much part of the beliefs of the Fae and the beliefs of the dragon. And the dragon represents that force, that consciousness. So all sort of separation wounding that we have, and all sort of traumas that we carry within ourselves, like lack of belonging, creates this scenario where we just aimlessly wander. And this is where I know you love that metaphor of like wandering in the Fae fog, and you wanted to talk about this. For me, it's very similar. Is that as self, as a being, we wander in this fog, in this illusion, not really finding the way home.
Yeah. Well, and like I like kind of joked with Dea privately where I was like, what is a projection? Which is one of the way the shadow manifests. We tend to project what we don't like in ourselves onto others. So I was like, what is a projection if not a mist of Avalon? And we can get kind of like stuck in this like different mist, or the Fae fog, we kind of called it, which isn't really like the mist of Avalon. It's more this illusion of projections based on kind of what we're saying, if we really have rejected that part of self.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were going to bring in the Avalon. You had a very specific experience of like what being in the midst of Avalon meant to you, and how Avalon shows up in relation to Dragon Shadow work. But let's just look at you've mentioned so many ways and practices that you help people with their Dragon Shadow work, and visualizing certain elemental experiences. So I'd love to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, like, well, and I hope that we're going to be able to break these things down in more detail as we kind of go.
Yeah.
Because for those that, like, hopefully everybody knows what the Faery Accord is, but it is, originally it was a threefold agreement between fairies, humans, and creatures contains mythological beings and the animal kingdom. And then Dea and I will get more in depth in this and how she's kind of adapted it and how I've kind of adapted it and how we're moving that forward so that it does encompass the fourfold with the dragon and the earth. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because in my methods, I actually find it more effective to isolate the components.
Mhm.
The reason for this is because it actually helps identify these things that we're saying. So, as an example, in a lot of things that I really like to do, I do a lot with the creature. Now, the creature components I take right to animals. If you want to try this at home right now, take an animal that you already have as a guide or one that you're attracted to, but most of us have already an animal ally. Or if we don't, maybe you're already attracted to an animal and it's kind of like always been in your life, or it's something that you really love. That, in my opinion, is part of your animal soul, usually, or a reflective part of your own self. And so, what you can do with something like that, and this is like, I don't know if you would agree with this, Dea, but this is like a lot of my practice involves getting people's dreams or like the otherworldly experience grounded into reality. And the animal is a great example of this because a lot of people have in-depth connections now. We aren't really needing, some of humanity is needing to evolve their spiritual gifts, but a lot of humanity is now so open. They're in the dream, they're in that Fae fog, they're in the illusionary world, and they're not bringing that into reality. And so the animal is a great way to kind of bridge that in and explore your shadow, because a lot of us will have a great dream relationship with an animal and not in the physical. But what we can do is we can look at the actual animals in the physical realm as a reflection. What are they actually doing? Because then you're taking myth right out of it and you're getting into the actual components, the medicine of the earth. Then you can also look at, using embodiments. I use a lot of embodiment practices. Now, from experience, please do not bring things into the body that do not feel good. They have physical ramifications for that, and it can be dangerous. It's no different than if you're gonna, shamanically kind of work on somebody. You usually want to keep them out of repeating that experience. But an animal for me and the creature is kind of a way that I might get clients to explore themselves. And then another reason why working with an animal is really effective is because of the creature component. You can then take something, if I'm working with a seal as an example, and I have this vulnerable quality of myself and everything else, and it's like, well, I wonder why I was attached to the seal. Well, then you go into the mythogenetics. So then you take Dea's, like what she teaches, you take that extra layer and you're like, okay, well, what is the seal attached to in my own blood lineage? Well, for me, I'm like mostly Scottish. So then I have the Selkie. It's like, so you kind of can traverse your own dragon Faery Accord shadow, like by things that you're already attracted to, by things that are already happening in your experience. And then I also do something in the Myrrh essence where that involves triggering embodied dream states. And the reason for that is because I have found that it's way more effective for us to individually identify things within our own experience than it is for an external to heal you. So when we safely and consciously bring something into the body, then we become our own conscious observer, and the body always has a physiological response to trauma, to fantasy, to stuff that are that remains unseen to us. So I guess like the myrrh essence would be more of like, that's just my own medicine where it was part of my Fae, like more of my Fae medicine. But hopefully I'm articulating these things properly, but it's very unique to the individual. And I do see the value in kind of isolating it, because to say like dragon shadow, it's like, okay, that could be so many things. And there's a lot of different ego stuff and things like that. So in my opinion, the animal is the best way to go, because that's your lower chakras. That's your animal soul. That's more of where you're going to get those reactionary fight flight reactions. And it's where a lot of trauma in the body and our experience is stored. So if you can work with an animal that's been similarly treated to you, it also allows us a safe way to project, so that if we are like a victim of assault or something like that, we don't have to, you don't have to integrate it that way. You can actually team up with your allies. I don't know if that like kind of made sense.
No, I agree, absolutely. And the only thing I would add is there are specific creatures, animals, that have a direct connection to the dragon. So they are actually manifested forms of the dragon. And horses, for example, are such beings. The raven or the crow are such animals. Often the white stag or the white hart is a manifested dragon being. Um, the serpent itself, that's self-explanatory, I think. So you can choose animal allies that are earthly bodies of the dragon, so that actually works through your process. But the thing is, if the ego identifies as the dragon, because I think it's important to say that the ego is again not something to battle, is not something to fight or reject. Or I personally do not believe in that. I think the ego is simply an interface that helps us communicate with the outside world. So we kind of be able to filter what comes in, and has these protective mechanisms that are not always serving us, but ultimately it is just a way that we identify the self, and how we want to be perceived by the outside world. So when we look at the ego again as part of the self, then we can look at the animal creatures and allies as a guide to understand ourselves. So different than working allyships that we develop with other conscious beings, these guides are actually helping us understand the self. So it's a midterm mission, not a lifelong mission, that integrates that part of the self, because we can actually, and this is where I sort of expand on this, that I like people to sort of become the creature a little bit, in an embodied sense. So this is where I think play is so healthy, just to play out, and sort of move and follow the motions, the thinking, the experience of the animal guide, and see kind of our world through their eyes. And that can also be done outside. So in interaction with nature. And a lot of the times when we are integrating a part of the self, the hardest part is to face it, right? The hardest part is to look at it and face it, because there will be aspects that we do not like. And it's actually an internal process to either get to love those parts, or simply accept them as they are, without judgment passed upon that aspect. And that is often easier done in nature, when we are able to interact with our senses. So it's not all kind of stuck in the mind of what we believe about that aspect of the self, or what we believe about that creature.
Yeah.
And the other layer to this is, the Fae can also be approached in such ways. And I do a lot of avatar work in my materials that I teach at Avalon Academy. We've sort of become the Fae avatar in order to interact with the world that is immediately in our surroundings, whether it's this reality or the other. So again, this is a form of um, creating a comfortable experience with that part of the self.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And thank you for mentioning the value of the embodiment. I've actually embodied, if I've put any creature in the body, that's actually as a shapeshifter, which I don't want to dive down that rabbit hole right now, but I do have really strong views on what actual shapeshifting is. And it's one of the it's the first documented human interaction with the psychological body. But yeah, Dea is definitely right. In the creature components, especially if you want to get in the creature, that is like, well, it's like one of my favorite parts of the whole experience. And my animal guides and the ability to shift into them, it's way different. I know, like, there's a difference as well I'd like to kind of highlight between embodying something or in the Fae avatar. And I know that Dea and I have had talks about this, so I know that we're on the same page. There is a difference between going out and playing and doing an embodiment, which is totally still healing and very valuable. And then there's another aspect of relating. It's relationship.
Yes.
So that's where the shape shifting actually becomes, if you're going to be like, oh, I can imagine that I'm this white heart, the stag. It's way different when you've worked with that animal, when you've, kind of gotten to know it, when you've maybe done some crafting, made your own antlers, felt how it feels in the body. It's way different because then when you're shifting into that, the rest of the physical reality will receive you as such because the relationship has been established. And to go off of what Dea is saying with the fairy aspect, I would not, in my personal journey and some of the people that I've worked with, there is no way that I would have received the integrations in the Fae and the Fairy and the Elf if I had not been establishing relationships with those otherworldly beings. It was not, they didn't just come in and say like, oh, hey, yeah, Raven, like, let's just like, here you go. Here's all the tools and gifts. It was very much, an equal exchange. I know at Avalon Academy, Dea says it all the time. It's about hospitality. It's giving and receiving, which is way different than, taking. Taking has a different energy and a different vibration. And I think that regardless of where we've placed the dragon in our shadow, and what it looks like on the surface in light or dark or whatever, that energy will be present if the dragon isn't integrated. It will be more about the self. It'll be more in this, like, what's in it for me? What have I got going on? And that's not bad when we're pouring from a full glass, but it is a different energy to give and receive than it is to like give and take. So
Yes, absolutely. And a large part of working with the mythical creatures and Fae folk is a journey of gifting, an energy exchange, a giving and taking, and the ability to specify that what we're exchanging is of equal value. Hospitality is certainly a layer of that, but like any, I think working sort of across the realms and below and above the consciousness horizon is always all relationships, which means they need to be attended to, they need to be maintained. And I think that can apply to our dragon shadow work as well as an angle, as a how to, even that it's going to be a relationship that is developed between you and your aspects, whether they are in the shadow or not, and that has to be maintained. And that is maintained through creating mutual understanding, so that that conversation need to be had. And I think this is where it sometimes gets stuck in the mental body, right? Because conversations, sometimes we've assumed that is only us kind of having the conversations in a meditative visualization state in our head, right? But we can have conversations and build relationship with non-physical beings in nature, right, through the elemental bodies, and we can build those relationships with our creature fae, because that includes the dragon as well, guides in nature. So that actually the elements of water, the trees, the wind, the soil become the conduit. They become kind of the language that we speak. And when we nourish and nurture those relationships, something else happens, which is very interesting because it's always a solution within a solution. That because the collective shadow of the dragon is separation from creation, and sometimes the problem is that what we see reflected back to us, you call it a sort of like a loop. So I want you to talk about the feedback loop in a minute, but the response from the outside world that we receive is often perceived through that very personal lens. It is also that response comes from this separation from creation, and when we engage with the elemental bodies of nature, we're actually simultaneously healing that separation, because nature takes a form in every living being in our world. So our relationship to soil, our relationship to water, our relationship to the physical informs the metaphysical, and vice versa. It's all interconnected. And so our relationship to each other then can be translated, and then this relationship can be translated to the self and the aspects of who we are and who we want to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And thank you for mentioning about the elements and nature and that release. And I think that I just like really want to reiterate that. Like, there's so much that we can like really, like, my mom actually taught me this. Like, she actually taught me that even when we're releasing quote unquote negative energy, it's actually just energy to the creator. It's energy. It doesn't have like, oh, this is bad, this is good. Like, it doesn't have that at this level that Dea is articulating in these elements in this soil. If you're the soil, you're moving through something, putting your hands in there, shedding a tear, releasing like energy, that still heals the earth as you're healing your own self in that like cycle. And in regards to like looping and the way that the shadow can loop and stuff like that, there are feedback loops that are maladaptive, and all that really means is that it's kind of a spiral that's going nowhere. It's going either nowhere, or it's not serving you and the collective at all. And I don't know, like, if you wanted me to kind of touch on this, but like one of the things that I've really noticed as a shadow worker collectively, is that especially in regards to social media, or when we're kind of in this, because that's like a whole other thing. So I'm kind of like apprehensive to even go there. But when we are doing shadow work of any kind, all the shadow wants is to be in relation with us, like Dea is saying. So all it wants is to be seen, held, accepted, nurtured. So in social media, we can end up feeding the shadow. So it's getting validated, it's getting all the likes, it's getting witnessed, it's getting everything. But if you're unaware of why you're doing something, of what's happening, of the actual current, then it's not getting integrated. And that is like, something we might touch on in greater depth, but just maybe, you don't have to judge yourself or get out of a maladaptive loop. It's more like redirecting the energy to earth. It's more understanding what's actually needed inside of your own self, and then nourishing that. And then another way that we can like look at the elements, because Dea and I, like, this is why I really like talking with Dea, is because I can kind of go into the mental body where I'm like, oh, okay, like if you look at water, water has an archetypal thing. We've given it words over every culture. We're like, oh, it's feminine, it's emotion, it's this. But water in real life is water, okay? It doesn't have a story. It has a unique experience with you. that's going to interact with you and heal you in different ways. But it's us that have put all these stories and these different things onto it. So you can kind of use that to your own advantage. And like, just really quick, some of the things that I have, done to kind of face my shadow head on is, if you get hit with a huge life experience, you're drowning. Right away, regardless of your experience, you can kind of use water in a metaphorical sense where it's like, okay, am I pooling water into a dead end connection? Because you're going to have to whirl around in that later. There's no judgment, but that's a whirlpool you're creating. And am I drowning right now? And are the people that I'm asking for help, are they pulling me out? Or am I pulling them down in with me? And like sometimes all we have to do is like kind of sit on the proverbial collective ship that is like sailing into the unfolding. And then the same with like Earth, like we can just like, and then I would love for Dea, after I'm done kind of articulating these, to kind of give like, okay, this is like how you can do it in the healing of the Faery Accord in the Earth, right? Like, because we can take water as a metaphor and just kind of ask ourselves, where am I right now? And if you're on the boat and smooth sailing, perfect. Then that's a great time to maybe go to a tree, root down, explore your roots, look at your whole self like a tree. And like, the deeper the roots, the higher the branches. So if you're all of a sudden in air and you're soaring like the eagle, just there's no problem with that. It's a great viewpoint of your own self. It's a neutralized viewpoint that can get you out of your personal experience and into something bigger than you. But if you're going to like fly high and not have roots, then you might collapse later. So these are just like things like, I don't know, I'm such like a tree lover. I know you are too, but I always say like trees represent a stable sense of self. So don't be afraid to throw your unstable self right into them. Cry into a tree, release into a tree, ask a tree what you can do, like look at yourself as your own world tree and kind of explore yourself that way. And even fire, like, don't be afraid to like burn yourself alive proverbially, like the white tree of Gondor, like we can just light ourselves up like the phoenix and burn. And those are some of the ways that like, I don't know, like I really like looking at things like metaphorically, because what this does is it really allows us to kind of get clear without the personal story.
Yeah.
It takes all the surface stuff out of it, and it like just gets you really clear at what's happening at your core.
But also like the metaphorical visualizations, that you've shared a couple of examples of here, they create comfortability. So you are able to get comfortable with those experiences that if you would obviously have flesh and blood, you'd probably have a different emotional response to them. So in the same way, we can metaphorically meet the part of the shadow, to meet the dragon in a scenario where we can observe ourselves in that journey. And this is exactly how you then work through to the healing of the Faery Accord, is these visualizations, and even the example you've given about sort of being in that conscious metaphorical boat just with other beings and sailing through life. Have those practices, but have them physically in nature. So I've always taken a step further, that okay, go out to the river and sit in the water, or sit on a raft, or put your feet, if it's not possible, sit in a bathtub, right? And act as in physical engagement with the living element, these visualizations. In a safe way, of course. Like, I'm not saying that trying to drown for real. What I'm saying is have an interaction with the element present in whatever way you can do so when you are doing these metaphorical journeys. So what happens is the experience leaves the metaphysical and the mind and becomes present in the elemental world. And a lot of the elements, especially water and fire, they are very good conduits to create transformation. So if something that you have experienced is kind of unfolded in a visualization that you want to let go of, then the elements can help you with that the same way the tree can. And I really think that a lot of the times, given this example at the very beginning of the dragon in the shadow comes to the surface and kind of overtakes, and then we have this god complex. For those people who've experienced that, there will be a humbling, there will be a collapse, and I think it's very helpful for them to invite a spirit guide, if you like, that is in a dragon form, right? So a creature guide in a dragon form is a metaphysical being, to help them integrate that experience. Because what the collapse will obviously be like a dark night of the soul, and that's inevitable. I think everyone who goes down the journey of wearing the dragon as their soul identity unaware will have a humbling process, and in that humbling process compassion has to be on the surface, and the dragon beings that are very much outside of ourselves, although they're connected to us, can help you to meet that compassion with them. So they actually become very, very supportive allies. And that's an observation I've had, that a lot of people who work with dragons as allies, as opposed to other metaphysical beings, have often had that sort of dragon shadow experience in the past, or maybe in another lifetime, but certainly a version of it in this one as well.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I totally agree. Like I always say to people about, I know a lot of people resonate with the way that I reflect the medicine of the ravens.
Mm-hmm.
So the raven, as Dea mentioned, especially in regards to like the Celtic, right?
Yeah.
In the Morgan, and then yeah, we have in Avalon, Arthurian legends, Morgana.
Yeah.
The ravens, for me, I said like that was kind of the animals that came in to help me in my unfolding, because unknown to me, I was more in like a real megalomaniac and not knowing. It
Mm-hmm.
was completely blind to me. And I had a lot of followers. Like it was actually scary. It was scary for how many people were like following my lead. Now on the surface, it was very beautiful cause, trying to save the world, but that was me projecting like my humanity outside of myself. And then what happened was, and you can see it, like that's another thing about the shadow. So if you're curious, if somebody's really being governed by that dragon shadow, they won't see it at all. And it will be like all of what you are seeing. It will be
Yes.
all of what you are seeing. And even if the words say love and light, I think of people that I've seen where they're literally tearing people apart, telling them to get out of their story under the illusion they're going the right way and things like that. So when people are going the one way and all this stuff, that is a classic sign that they might be in a megalomaniac god complex, like we were talking about at the beginning. And then yeah, like after, when I had this big collapse and I was integrating the dragon consciously, I had a lot of help. We all have help, and I've seen it in other people unfolding the same way. And I think that's what Dea was trying to get me to kind of talk about in the Fae fog, which we can dive into like maybe in another episode or something. We
Sure.
can really talk about how it manifests inside that. But the ravens really helped me kind of like unfold and see, and the humbling came with like this surrendering.
Mm-hmm.
Because the truth is that if you find yourself in this, and yes, it is a dark night of the soul, but as somebody that kind of has had a lot of dark nights of the soul, the dragon integration dark night of the soul was way different, and it was very
Yeah.
intense. But the beauty of it is that it's very divine, because we're touching in the pure creational
Mm-hmm.
force. So if you really can let go and surrender and understand that all you're doing is integrating that shadow head on consciously, then you will notice that what you need, the reflections you need, the aid that you need is actually there. And in exchange, you being you and reflecting out your truth of what you're experiencing and grounding that helps other people. And I've seen that in not just me, like I've actually seen this happen in quite a few dragon Fae souls.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very beautiful way of transmuting, and show, and once you've obviously out on the other end, you can reflect on your own journey, as a sort of tool for others. Like, look, this is how it felt and looked when I've gone through it. Especially if people are in a stage of their workings with dragon consciousness, which is the stage of confusion, because, and there is one, because there's such polarities exist. Like the dragon illuminated is exactly what you said. It's pure, eternal life force. It's a knowing that is always authentic and truthful, and there's a lot of information and memories within that knowing that is accessible. But the opposite of that is everything that is opposite of that. So such immersed, as I said, the dragon shadow is huge. It's such a huge polarity, that when you're in the middle of those, you're like, oh, I'm so confused right now. I had, my experience was the other one I've mentioned, actually. So we spoke about, the God complex that can manifest. Mine was more of the relationship to power, and sort of welcoming spiritual power and understanding spiritual power, and not being afraid of it. So not trying to be the hero, not trying to be the lion that defeats the dragon, not trying to be the righteous hero, the masculine hero, actually, that battles that creational force within, but actually observing it and realizing that it's a part of me. And when you do that, something will click, something will switch, and you then start to focus on, okay, if this is me, and how does my spiritual power looks like? And when I use the word power, I don't mean dominance. I don't mean tyranny. I mean energy that is yours, your ability to manifest in accordance with your free will, right? And then at that point, you can observe certain patterns like, oh, wow, I actually am part of something very profoundly creational, and I can create in accordance with that. But if I try to create in accordance with my sort of lower motives or personal intentions, it doesn't quite manifest. So at that stage, you've really hugged the dragon, metaphorically speaking, and it kind of became a friend. And it's very calming, it's very profound, and it's very sovereign and comfortable and warm, fuzzy feeling, truly, to get to that point. And there is really no inner turmoil. And then at that point, there's no this difficulty of, there's no need for the I am statements and the I am presence, and like, the ego gratification. And because it's just accepted as what it is. So, there's this saying that a true complete human being, or a true complete being, I should say, is aware of its many multifaceted reality, and it is in awareness and conscious love and compassion with all aspects of the self. And that's kind of the journey.
Yeah, I love that sharing. And I think that is another way, like, that we really can see it manifesting, is kind of what you said about that power. I had that as well in the Dragon Mother type hero type
Mhm.
thing. And that's, what keeps coming to mind when you share is, and I don't watch this show, and I know you don't either, but Game of Thrones type energy, like those types of like dragon type rising, where I see it, and it's very much like I'm all for divine feminine rising. I totally feel yin collectively, but if it's got kind of its fist in the air, and I'll maybe use that as a metaphor, I would say literally hug yourself. You gotta hug yourself and understand nobody's taken your power. They haven't taken your power. It's there all along. And we don't have to necessarily like fight externally, and it is quite humbling. And I've been really connecting to that, Awen, the medicine, like this divine. And it's so, it really does shift a lot. Like, that's kind of the difference. Like, that's the difference for me, is from what I've seen in the collective, is like, if a light has an agenda or has something that they want you to do, that's a shadow. It doesn't matter if it looks pretty, because when we're really connected and tapped in, we start not having to compete. We don't need to fight. If a shadow gets revealed and somebody has a problem with you or you notice it in yourself, it just gets acknowledged and loved right there. It's kind of more of this beautiful fluid flowing. And I think that for those that are really resonant with the Fae soul and like doing the dragon, that's like the greatest gift that you can give yourself and others on this journey, is like just kind of zooming out with loving awareness and really just like kind of holding all of those aspects of yourself instead of denying them. So if you have a little megalomaniac leader tyrant in you right now, or somebody that's like not or somebody that's like, super afraid of their power, that's okay. But knowing that is beautiful, because that's the medicine, right? We don't want to push those aspects away, because that's where they get a lot of power. And then you will end up in false Avalon rabbit holes.
Absolutely wandering in the mist. And it's also like that, like you really find your tribe, and those that are, as the support system that you've mentioned earlier, when you actually own this aspect of yourself and just say, yeah, that it's there, and it's in my conscious awareness, and it's part of me. Now, and loving that part of the self, it doesn't mean that we're justifying that self acting out in a destructive way, right? We're not justifying the actions that may follow, that aspect of the self acting harmfully. Is just purely the recognition and the ability to compassionately be aware that there is part of me and there is part of you that depicts those that has those thoughts and has those beliefs and has those identities, and they not at every stage of the journey will serve you necessary, but they're still there. And this is where mitogenetics is, I think, is so powerful, because we realize that the Fae, the dragon, the mythical beings that are within us, they not only are archetypal, they're not just a manifestation of a mind. They are a lineage, right? A mythological lineage. And because we were born on a specific land, because in our blood there's myth in our blood as well as history, we've actually connected to those ancient mythological beings through that, and often subconsciously manifest those beings in ourselves, right? So as you said, because of the Scottish heritage, your water or mer being might be a selkie. So then you can go into okay, let's understand the selkie. Who is the selkie? How does the selkie feels, looks? What's the selkie experiences? Look at the myth, knowing that, meet a selkie in a conscious visualization, talk to it, build that relationship. You'll find that within us, there are many of these archetypes. In fact, not just creature, fae, and human. I mean, we are addressing those three because they're quite dominant to our understanding of, creating this new world, this new Avalon that is healed and healing in a sense that we are able to build healthy relationships amongst each other, but amongst the physical and the metaphysical world and in Gaia itself. And once those healthy relationships are formed, the power we have to create is actually is endued and encoded into that understanding. So the product of that new world is not harmful.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so true. It just comes back to right relationship, I think, with everything. And the lands, I would really like to touch just briefly without going into too much depth. I'm a settler on the lands that I'm on. So it's a little bit different than Dea, who I think is maybe on lands that's closer to her blood lineage. And so I did notice that, and even to talk about the raven, I think that's why the raven really came in, not just because it's my name, but like, I think it came in as well because of, it was a link. It was a way to link the lands that I'm actually on to reconcile the energy with the blood lineage that I'm in. And that took me a lot of work. And I think that those that are on the Western soil, and there's prophecies that say this in the myth as well. So
Yeah.
you can check those out. But I think that was kind of more of like the soul contract. I think there's like a little bit of a different component. So, and that goes back to what Dea was saying earlier with having that relationship, that healing exchange with the land, with the water, with everything. If you reside on lands that are not on your blood lineage, you're going to have to kind of see, my advice to you reflected out, see what historical things or stories are connected between your actual blood lineage of lands you might not be, living on. Like me, all of my blood is over where Dea is, and then I'm over here. So from my experience, I actually did have to do a lot of bridging work with that. And that's like another form of right relationship. So the land is another component that we do have to kind of consider. And then when we have that like good stable base, yeah, the Selkie, like all those things. And to just kind of talk about mythogenetics and stuff, that's the key component there, is that once you know the myth, and Dea and I did talk about this on the Confessions of a Fae Soul podcast, is it's the myth that you resonate with. So if you read the Selkie Bride, and the Selkie Bride is like the most famous myth of the Selkie, and that doesn't resonate with you, and you're like, no, I don't see this manifest in my life at all, then that's not really for you, and that's okay. But knowing the story allows us that extra kind of level of self-observation where it's like, am I reenacting this? Because I know like we're both, and that is like the beauty of arriving home in the body, in the self, in this creation, is that then you actually get really kind of aware of the characters that are kind of already interacting in your mythogenetics. And then that's when you can actually even, in my experience, then I can kind of step outside of them even further and allow those relationships to be even more kind of removed from me in a way that allows me to have right relationship with those characters, stories, and themes, as opposed to embodying them unconsciously. Like, I just kind of think of Organa,
Exactly. So it's not only the myth that you resonate with, but it's the myth that you're actually excited about. Is usually the one that you make your own, and the myth that you hear as a child, your favorite story, that applies to film as well, is what you will subconsciously archetypally connect to. But I often found, and that's my studies been proving that quite consistently, that actually that myth that you resonate with, your fave story, is actually happen to be connected to your mythogenetics, your lineage. Now, either your ancestors lived on the land the myth comes from a long time ago, or you are on the land the myth comes from. So you've born there, right? So there's already a connection. There's always a thread that, in hindsight, proves that the chosen myth is more than just something that you resonate with, or the resonance actually comes through the blood. And yes, if you are, on colonized land, where you are not indigenous, your sort of relationships that you got to develop is first and foremost with the land of your home. Those relationships, the spirit beings that exist within that land has to come first, right? And then I think most of the time I find that there is always a connection, even in this situation. Like the land that you choose to reside on has often a myth that you will find a very similar version of at your indigenous land as well. And, there might be minor differences, but myth is multicultural, it's multiversal, and it transcends timelines, which is why we have all these similarly sounding stories in different cultures, although there is no possibility of them ever meeting and sharing the stories amongst themselves. But I think, and this is going to be my closing statement personally, to say that although we look at the beings of our consciousness, and we look at shadow identities, and we look at these metaphysical beings as part of the self, um, it doesn't mean that this only exists in the mind. And to hold the belief that all indigenous cultures were illusionary or confused in their belief that these beings very much existed in the past and they were part of the reality that which they observed on the day to day, how they observed animals and plants, and they had all that knowledge about animals and plants and supernatural beings because they didn't separate the two. So to say that that only exists within their mind and psyche, I think it's a very arrogant statement, and I would never make it. But what does happen is because it existed in a timeline and in the myth that they raised our ancestors with, and then it's part of ourselves through the DNA. We actually carry an information of those beings, of those archetypes within our consciousness. So it is part of the psyche and it is part of Earth history simultaneously at the same time.
Yeah. And yeah, I completely agree. And it's been great. Yeah, you have to, you can really get stuck if you're going to compartmentalize it there. I think it's helpful for people that are more logical or people that are just embracing this and they kind of need that component to bring it into reality. Or people that are way too in the Fae fog and off dancing around in non-reality, then it can be a way to like ground. But we really, like Dea said, I fully agree. Our ancestors, regardless of where you came from, were operating with the other world as this world.
Yes.
And in the indigenous lands that I'm on and the lands that Dea is on, they would have been journeying and honoring the dream as the medicine. They wouldn't have been doing anything that wasn't coming from the other world. So I love that. I love this, and I love that more of us are kind of, really looking at these aspects of ourselves so that we can ground a more mythically embodied experience and like remember the other world as more than the mind. Because when we keep it in the mind and the archetypes, like that's where it becomes just a dream. And then that's where it kind of remains on the screen or it remains in this like closet instead of us actively owning our power in unison with Earth and healing it, which we are fully capable of doing if we get out of our own way.
Exactly. We create separation by almost trapping these archetypes. I mean, even looking at them as archetypes, we're just trapping them in the self, in the inner, and not realizing that although that is true, it exists in the outer as well. And not only does it exist, it is connected. And this is what you've so beautifully put with that. Sometimes when we have feedback from the outside world as an experience, it needs to be rooted in the heart of Gaia. It needs to have a heart. It needs to be true in a way. That's how I always understood it, that it needs to confirm and affirm. The inner needs to speak to the outer reality and experiences. Right. So thank you so much for listening, guys. And thank you so much, Raven, for sharing this space with me and discussing this. We really do hope that we have given you some nuggets of wisdom here that you can further take on your journey. And I think we will progress to further episodes and going into the Faery Accord itself and look at the Fae as a separate consciousness, the creatures, separate consciousness, and the human as well, because we've got to, also speak to our humanness and our human experience in this great journey of life and understanding the self and belonging to this universal consciousness that is. Thank you very much.